Hi all. This week we're learning about how groups relate to their context and why that matters. Typically, when people talk about a group or team, we tend to think of it as a discrete unit. We say things like my family or our team or the support group as though the boundaries of the group are really clear. And many group scholars have studied groups in this way for decades, treating a group as a kind of closed entity and just looking at how group members communicate with each other. This can offer a lot of things. It helps us understand group dynamics and communication processes, and a lot of our class modules do a kind of deep dive on different communication processes that happen in groups. But just looking at what happens inside a group can only show us so much. So in this module, we take seriously the idea that groups always exist in some kind of context. There's a really strong connection between that context and the communication that happens in the group. So one theory that takes context seriously is called the bona fide groups perspective, which we read about this week. This theory was developed in the 1990s, and it still has a major impact on the field of group communication. So the bona fide groups perspective has two big claims that are important for how we understand groups. First, groups have boundaries that denote who's a member of the group and who isn't. But those boundaries are not static. They are fluid and they're permeable. This means that they change over time and people come in and go out. The boundaries are not like firm and strong. We might have a clear sense of who the group members are, but inevitably over time there will be some change. Think about families, work teams, sport teams, social clubs, nonprofit organization boards, support groups, and so on. All of these have shifting boundaries because new members join, some members leave, groups become bigger and smaller at different times, and so on. So shifting membership is just part of group life. So people who study groups and design and lead groups should just assume that membership will shift and there will be changes in what the group boundary is. There may be some people who are core anchors who are there for a long, long time, but that doesn't mean that the group as a whole is going to always be the same. So why does this matter for group communication? Well, you can probably think of groups that you've been in that had a new member who came in and made a big impact on the communication, for better or for worse. Sometimes new members can contribute a lot to the group through new knowledge, or great relational communication skills, or expertise in some sort of communication process like decision making or conflict management. When new members join the group, it often creates an opportunities for groups to reflect on their purpose or identity. This happens in work teams and social groups, but even families. Right? If you think about if somebody gets married or brings a new partner in, or even like a child is born into a family, it can shift kind of what it means to be a part of that group, and people's roles within the group change. You can also think about how groups shift when people leave the group. And again, these shifts can be for better or worse. If a beloved family member passes away, it can have a profound impact on the family's communication. If a friend moves and leaves the group or has a big conflict and then leaves, the group of friends might have big shifts in how they communicate, and they may even drift apart. If a very aggressive and dominating member leaves a work team, then the group has a chance to kind of reset. And if the group goes through major shifts in who members are over time, that can have a big impact on how the group communicates. So despite all these fluctuations in membership, a group can still have a strong sense of identity. Think about sports teams. Over the years, the team will have lots of different players, and yet they're still recognizably that team, right? The Ohio Bobcats or whatever it is. Work teams and organizations can have the same sort of stable identity, and so can families. So even as we acknowledge that group membership changes because boundaries are fluid and permeable, we also recognize that groups have some sort of recognizable groupness. They have some sort of sense of identity. So the second thing the bona fide groups perspective points out is that groups are always embedded in context. To really understand a group, we should pay attention to how the group relates to other groups, what context is like, how the context has shifted over time, and how those shifts are evident in the group's communication. This is pretty easy to see in a work team. So like the work team exists in some sort of organization that has a mission, an organizational culture, specific sort of goals and work processes. and probably lots of other groups or teams within the organization. So looking at context in this way, we can ask things like, how much power does our work team have compared to other groups in the organization? Do our team members also belong to any of these other groups? If so, what role do they have in these groups? How about timing? Is like the work in our team impacted in any way by what other groups in our organization do? Inevitably, the answer is yes to these questions, right? How do those interconnections with the other groups shape our communication in our team, and how can our communication have some sort of impact on other groups in the context? So the bona fide group perspective says pay attention to that kind of context. An organization, of course, also exists in a context. So as it gets bigger and bigger, we can think about how the larger social and even sort of physical geographical context can matter, or the industry context. So any major shifts like new technological innovations, or industry regulations, or a global health crisis, or economic changes, those are a big deal, and they inevitably have some sort of impact on the organization, which means there's going to be impacts on the work team, right? So think about how communication changed for many people when organizations responded to COVID by having folks work remotely. Were you in any groups that had to shift the way you work to use technology rather than meeting in person? How did that shift change the way you communicate? How do group members manage the multiple roles that they had to play in a specific moment when working from home, especially if they had family members or other people in their homes who needed their attention? So clearly these shifts had an impact on how teams and communities did their work. So I've been using a work example here, but other groups are obviously also embedded in their context and are responsive to their shifts in their environment. So the readings this week highlight how scholars study groups in a way that takes context seriously. And as you work your way through this material, I encourage you to think about how these ideas are evident in groups in your own life. So that's it for now. I look forward to reading your reflections, and as always, let me know what kind of questions you have.